First up, we have Brian Blumhagen. Brian has spent the majority of his life working in the swine industry, including stints in production, genetics, nutrient management, facility maintenance, and new facility construction. He is currently Director of Operations for Altenburg Construction, which does slat replacements. He has a Bachelor's of Science degree and an MBA from Iowa State University and currently resides in Ames.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for inviting me today. And yeah, she said I had a terrible commute this morning. I had to get from the north side of Ames to here. But yeah, I think maybe while some people are still trickling in here, before I get into the nuts of it, I really enjoyed Steve's presentation this morning, first thing, as he talked about, the rapid change coming at companies and businesses in the world. And I particularly liked the story about the Gen Z girls sitting at the Arizona baseball game, the Diamondbacks, and I could relate to that. I have a 20-year-old Gen Z daughter who had the opportunity to study abroad this spring semester in the Czech Republic. And so my wife and I took the opportunity in early April to go over there for 10 days and travel with our Gen Z daughter throughout some really beautiful cities in Europe. And one of those cities we traveled to was in Vienna, Austria. And in Vienna, Austria, for those that have ever been, you've probably heard of the Belvedere mansion, if you will. And so we were doing the tourist thing, and we were at the Belvedere Museum in Vienna, Austria. And there was one particular thing that my Gen Z daughter wanted to see at this mansion, and it was in their art exhibition. And they had this famous painting called The Kiss. And what The Kiss is just, it was an Austrian artist in the early 1900s, did this oil painting, and he used gold leaf, and it's two lovers in an embrace. And anyway, I guess it was something. I'd never heard of it. But apparently they value this thing at like $400 to $800 million. And so we're on this tour, and we're going through, and I wasn't sure where it was at in the facility, but as we're walking through it, you walk into this room that's probably 40 by 40, and I know I'm in the room because of the crowd of people that are all kind of huddled around. Probably call it 75 to 100 people trying to crowd around this piece of artwork. And the Gen Z moment for me was, if there, let's just say it was 100 people there, there was probably 25 people looking at the painting. What do you suppose the other 75 people in the room were doing? All right, you're all kind of holding out your phones. It was literally this. So the photo's behind me, and it was trying to get the perfect shot to post on social media. And I stood there for a long time watching this, and I was watching people cycle in and out for the full time. So let's say you spent maybe 10 minutes in that room. The majority of the people, 9 of the minutes, were trying to stand in line to get the perfect shot, and then the other minute was actually looking at the photo. I don't know what that means or how that relates to hog buildings, but there's a lot of lessons there probably. But it was really profound for me, and I really appreciated Steve's story this morning about that. So what I'm going to talk about here for the next 30 minutes is a kind of a catchy term for me, the tsunami of the aging barns we have in the industry. And that's really what I spend the majority of my time in, is in all these facilities of all ages that we've built in the industry over the last 30 years. And that's really the time period where we've really moved from the outside to the indoors, is over the last 30 years. And so those barns we built in 1996 are 30 years old today. So I'm going to cover 4 things here. One, I'm going to start out and try to give you some understanding of what the current realities of the Midwestern infrastructure are. I'll get into, rather than showing what to inspect when, I'm going to use a case study of an actual real site that we just took down to the bare bones and built back, and what that cost, what we did. I'm going to wrap up talking more specifically about the slats. That's our business. That's what we spend most of our time in. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on that because it's an area that people have just taken for granted maybe for the last 30 years because they just worked and they were always there, but we're coming to the end of the useful life on those, and those have some real implications for the industry in terms of how we're going to reinvest in these facilities. Will we reinvest in them? And that, so I'll try to give you a better understanding of how we look at that and some of the tools we use to help producers make better decisions. So one of my roles is when I came to Altenburg was to try and understand the size and the scope of what's coming at us as an industry. And so I've just backed into the December 2025 hogs and pig reports, and I basically said how many hogs sit in each state. I'm assuming those hogs are either in a 1,200 head room barn or a 1,200 head, room, if you will. And then I'm just assuming that that facility had a 30-year life. Now, the curtains don't last 30 years. Most of the roof steel won't last 30 years. The gating, this is all. But in general, from a slat and beam perspective, that's about the most you're going to get out of these. And so if you back into all that, basically what it says is, for the state of Iowa, there's 680 barns that are aging out every year, right? If you assume we built those confinement facilities over the last 30 years evenly. And so if you take really the pig producing states in the Midwest, that's about 1,550 barns that we're aging out a year of 1,200 head equivalents, okay? So that either means we need to put a lot of money into these or we need to build new ones and tear the old ones down. And if you haven't looked at the cost of new construction, which I'll get into here in the next few slides, I don't think that's going to be a real viable option for us. These next few slides I got from Dusty Compart with Compeer Financial. He gave this presentation, I think it was a year or two ago, and I found it really interesting. And so this slide on the left, basically, the bars are the cost per pig space to build a finishing barn, and then the yellow line is the interest rate over that same time frame. So we kind of had a perfect storm, if you will, for a cost per production standpoint where, just prior to COVID, let me back up. When I started building a lot of barns in 2017, we could build a turnkey tunnel vent deep pit barn in the Midwest for about $285 a pig space. Over the next 4 to 5 years, just prior to COVID, we got up to we finished construction, we were probably building them for $385 a pig space on the last ones. Those same barns today are $425, $450 maybe in Minnesota. But combination of the inflation we saw during COVID that hit everything in pig barns and the materials to build them were no different, combined with, we were building those barns with 4% and 5% capital, and today it's 7-8% capital. And what they figured was an 11% increase in building costs was about equal to a 1% increase in interest rates. So at the same time, we got rapidly appreciating costs to build these barns and rapidly increasing cost to finance these barns. So what's the message behind that? Trying to cash flow these under this model is very difficult, particularly if you're a contract grower. And so will we build some new barns? Yes, but unless the economics of this change, you can see on the chart on the right, today, or in 2025, it took $43.27 just to service the debt. So who wants to sign up for a 20-year note just to get the manure, right? That's not super appealing. And so kind of gets into what are we going to do with these existing facilities. Something else they looked at was the farms that are being up for sale, what are they going for? And so they categorized them basically into 3 categories. A 90s to 2000 usable barn. It's not terrible. It's probably had some work done on it. Those are being sold at $150 to $225 a pig space. The total overhaul barn that has had very little care and upkeep, and it's basically worth the footprint that it sits on in that, and that was probably being valued at $100. And those guys probably built those things for $120 to $150 a pig space. And then there's the overhauled barn that's had significant improvements on it, bringing $250 to $275. And the point that from their standpoint, from a lending perspective, obviously, is there's a large amount of 90s and 2000 barns that are requiring reinvestment in them. And then the last one was just, if someone's going to buy that facility, what are they going to loan it? How far will they go on a loan on that? And what's going to be the loan payment on that? And so that, Usable barn at $180 a space, they'll only finance that a max of 7 years. And so with an 85% loan to appraised value, that payment's about $2,750. Conversely, if you have the overhauled barn, they will finance that for an additional 5 years because it has more useful life. Not much difference in the cost per pig space from a loan repayment standpoint. So that's kind of broadly, the base of what the industry has out there in the marketplace. We had the opportunity as a business, this would be December of 2024. There was a facility northwest of Fairmont, Minnesota. It was a 4,000 head facility, 2 barns. It had been severely neglected, as you'll see here in the next few slides. It was in receivership, so it was in bankruptcy. It had not had hogs in it for 5 years. I wish we'd have flown a drone over it at the beginning because it would have been better, but I'll show you a few of these photos. But for you Gen Zers in here, the term I think that you would use is these facilities had left the chat, so to speak, and we're in pretty rough shape. So I think this is as bad as it can get, and I can show you what we did start to finish and what that cost. And incidentally, that wasn't the worst part of the roof. We'll get to that. So again, ceiling falling down, bulk bins full of feed. You can imagine what that was like over sitting for 5 years with water leaking into them. The steel was a little thin in spots on the roof. Oddly enough, the trusses were in pretty good shape. All we really had to do was replace the purlins, which was those cross members that we screw that roof steel down into. We did have to plate all the trusses. Something else to note on this site, there was no connecting hallways. The load chutes, in southern Minnesota in January, that's not a real desirable way to load hogs. And single bins on a single room, so they weren't in tandem, any of those sorts of things. In most cases, you're not going to have to drop a ceiling and re-insulate a facility. Because this had so much water in on it, that R value was pretty poor. We were going to make this a wean to finish barn, and we knew we needed to have better insulation in it. We knew we needed to plate the trusses, and so all that gets a lot easier if you just drop the ceiling and start over, and so we made the decision to do that. This is the final product. When we got done with it, it took us about 2.5 months to do that. So as you can see there, we completely reskinned, re-insulated, new ceilings, actuated inlets, all new curtains, all new hog panel. We doubled up the bulk bins, so we had to buy 4 bulk bins, re-pour those. We brought them all to the front half of the site. We made a connecting hallway with a concrete chute, covered. We put showers in the site. Something else that was pretty significant you wouldn't normally have to do in a facility like this is we had to drill a well because this was part of a bankruptcy. We were pulling water off a building site just to the northeast here that you can't see. And trying to get an easement on a well in bankruptcy is complicated. And we just decided it was cheaper and faster to drill a well. So that was a significant expense that we had. And then in the back corner, you can't quite see it, but the pig owner that was going to place pigs in the facility, their biosecurity required that we have a composter. So we built a composter on site. Incidentally, I kind of glossed over that. Before we took this on and agreed to do it, we had a contract. We had a pig owner that was interested in putting this facility on a long-term contract. So that made the decision of what we did and how we spent money a lot easier to make. Another interesting thing, we've been talking about AI this morning. So this would have been around December of 2024. I started dipping my toes into AI. And our construction guy that was heading up this project came to me and said, hey, we got to build a composter. What do I build? I don't have any idea. And I've had some experience doing that. And I thought about it. I'm like, yeah, I can go research the extension reports and look it up, and I can do the math and the calculations, and I can figure all this out. But I think at the time it was probably ChatGPT. I simply told the model, I said, I need to build a composter in Fairmont, Minnesota. It's got this many head of capacity. This is my expected death loss. This is how roughly big the pigs are going to be when they're going to die. This is my carbon source. give me the dimensions of a composting facility. And in 10 seconds, it kicked it out. And you got to be smart enough to know, is that right or wrong or accurate? And I would say it was 95% accurate. And then my follow-up question was, can you give me a drawing with the rebar placement? And in another 10 seconds, I had that, right? I am 100% confident I am the only person on the face of the earth that was asking AI how to build a composter in southern Minnesota that day, and that was 2 years ago. So again, it just highlights all the different ways you can use this tool out there. And that would have taken me 2 hours probably of looking up information and doing the math and double checking. So anyway, that was the site. Obviously, the inside of it turned out really nice, all new gating, feeders, equipment. We did not have to do the slats on this business. I will show you the prices here in a little bit, and I will include slats in that, but in this facility, we did not, full disclosure, have to do the slats. But the only thing that remained was the pit and the shell. Everything else was new. So this is what we spent. Again, we didn't do slats and beams, but I threw that in there. If you were to do that on a per pig basis on a facility like that, $80 would be the high side of that number. For the new equipment, which was gates, feeders, feed system, controllers, fans, inlets, heaters, we spent $87 a pig space. New roof, ceiling, curtains, and hog panel. And again, in most cases, you wouldn't have to do the ceilings, but we spent about $34 a pig space on that. All new plumbing, electrical, $20. Composter, the chute in the hallway was $10. The new well, again, was really significant, almost $33,000. The insulation was $20,000, and the propane lines were that. So we did all that for just under $1 million, or about less than $250 a pig space. I think that's the absolute maximum. If you wanted to gut your facility, that's what you're going to spend. Next topic I want to touch on is our slat vision inspection system. We developed this about a year ago, and we did this for several reasons. Number one, we've been doing inspections for many years. It was kind of hard and clunky. The output took a lot of time and effort, and we wanted to refine that process. We wanted to make it as objective as we possibly could. We wanted to be really simple and easy for our customers to interpret and look at it and get a sense, okay, this is the story behind the slats and beams in my barn. And the third thing we wanted to do, we wanted to give decision makers, because a lot of our customers have really large systems with many hundreds of barns in some cases. And we wanted to give them a roadmap to say, okay, if I've got $50 million of capital to spend next year, what are the worst barns in our system that we want to focus those capital dollars on? And so the system does give a nice summary for all the barns that a particular customer would have on it. And then lastly, we wanted to speed up the process for us. So I can do an inspection start to finish in about an hour per barn by the time I actually observe what I need to do and then provide the report. Again, we want it to be really simple and easy to interpret, and we find colors for most of our audience, which is men, makes it easier for them. But we're evaluating basically 4 things on the flooring system: the slat health, the beam health, the column health, and then they aggregate and we give an overall barn score. So if you think down here, like the colors mean what you would think they would. The dark green here, a barn starts out with the best score of its life is 100. As it moves through its life cycle, it gets to light green, yellow, orange, and then red. We've inspected about 500 barns on the platform today. About 55 to 60% are falling in that yellow category. Probably another 35% are falling in that orange. And orange is kind of the one where we call it our replacement threshold. And what we're trying to do is give people a window of time to make a sound business decision, so it's not urgent, right? So think of that as like a 3 to 5 year period where if you're going to do new gating, it's probably the right time to do slats as well, so you don't have to tear out the new gates and put the slats back all in and out. And so that's what we try to do, is give people, okay, of the barn that I have, what type of condition it's in, how much time do I have left? And then the red is simply, when I walk out of there, I'm going to tell them, I said, I wouldn't let my family load hogs out of here. It's that dangerous sort of thing. Fortunately, we've only had a handful of barns that are actually in the red category, but they do exist. The reality is we never get to look at the new stuff unless it's a tornado or a fire. But we're spending most of our time in the barns of the 500 are in that fair or poor condition and getting ready for replacement. So the first output that a customer would see on the very first page is just simply this. So again, the colors match up. That curved line is what we say is the industry average. So in a finisher barn, slat and beam, we see 25 to 35 years catches the reins in a finisher slat and beam. And so if you're to the right of that line, which the dot is your individual barn, that's how it scored. And so it was in the orange category. It scored 28 as its aggregate score. It's aging better than the industry average, so good for you. You got to put it off. But you're probably 2 years away from that red category, so you need to make a decision or start making a decision, if that makes sense. So that's really quick and dirty. The reports can be 6 to 7 pages long with photos and all that. The other thing we do in that report is we call out immediate issues. So we'll look at barns all the time and you'll say, okay, your barn's got 5 years left, but you have an immediate issue in this one area we need to deal with. Don't put pigs in that pen until we get it taken care of. And we call that out in a special section. And then we give a summary basically of this is why your barn scored the way it did. And I don't know if I mentioned it. One of the other reasons we did this is we've been doing inspections for years, and we would do an inspection for a client. We'd send it off to them. 3 years later, they would come back and say, hey, didn't you inspect this barn at one point? And we're like, yeah. Well, what'd you do with the report? Well, I sent it to X, Y, and Z. Well, they left the company 3 years ago, and I don't know where that report is. So all this stuff is housed on the cloud. Clients have a unique login. They can log in, see all their barns, all their individual reports. They can rank them in different ways, and so all that's based on the cloud, so it's easily stored and accessible in the future. I'll move into the last part, and we'll just talk about more of the mechanics of what we're looking at when we go into a barn. You guys have probably seen the slides on the left for a long time. We've been using those. That's just what happens when we lose a beam out of a beam pocket on the end of a barn. The next two slides are actually in a barn I was in last Friday, so that one's really current. Similar thing, if you look here in this middle one, I'm not sure exactly why this one failed. It was either the beam pocket there on the slide on the right. You can see that little box next to the slat that's still on there. The beam slides into that. But the real issue here is I think, was this center column. You can see there. And the beam to the left was sitting on about, let's say that column was 14 inches wide. That beam was sitting on probably 12 inches. The beam that's now in the pit was probably sitting on 2 inches, right? And you can say, well, Brian, it lasts for 25 years that way. Well, it lasted till it didn't, and when it went, it was violent, right? And this, more than anything, is what we're trying to catch in those inspections. The deteriorations of slats and beams happens over 30 years, and it's slow. When you have these surface-bearing issues, which exist, and there's a ton of them out there, when they let loose, it happens quickly, and that's the result. And so that's what we spend a lot of our time focused on, is not only what are the types of cracks we're seeing, but more importantly, how is everything set in place, and how is that load being spread out over that area. So real quick and dirty, when we inspect a barn, people are always like, do you go in the pits? No, we don't go in the pits. If we have to, it's a much different price point. I can't imagine what I'd have to charge for me to go into pit every day. One, it's dangerous, and yeah, it would be difficult. We can tell 95% of what we need to see from above. We like it clean, dark, and dry. I love inspecting barns at night because when you got a flashlight, it's all very easy to see what you need to. Occasionally, I won't say we don't ever get in a pit, but it's usually on a cattle barn for various reasons, and yeah. So the beams, which are what the slats set on and the beams set on top of the columns, they all age a very similar way. And in this top picture on the top left, you can see those diagonal cracks right above the column. That's generally how they start. And so when we're going through and evaluating, that's what we're doing. We're counting what cracks we see, how many of them, what are the cracks doing, how far have they spread, are they still on top of the column, have they moved off? Eventually, over time, what happens is once that crack occurs, it's now that rebar is exposed, it's encased in that concrete. And what steel does when it rusts, it expands and it starts blowing that concrete apart. And it starts creating that crack that chases across the bottom of the beam. And that's what we're looking at and measuring and feeding into the report. You can see up here in this middle picture on the top what that starts to look like when it really compresses in there. Middle picture down below, again with the ladder, that's a surface bearing issue where it's slipped off that beam. That one fortunately didn't go all the way in, it just wedged. But that's the other thing that we're looking at down through that crack. And then this lower right, that's an extreme case where somebody waited too long to make an investment in that facility. The problem with that is it gets really expensive for us to do that type of replacement. When we get them in that orange category, we can use our buggies and our equipment, and we can do it really quickly and safely. When they get to that condition, we aren't comfortable putting our crews and our equipment in those situations. So now we got to do it the really hard, slow, expensive way. And it basically doubles the labor cost on that slat replacement when you let it go. And I don't know if you can see it, but the rebar is literally falling out of the bottom of those beams there. And so just maybe a little bit, if we start to see that crack, how quickly does it move? Once it's there and it's formed, once it leaves the top of that column, it starts to move pretty quickly. And so that's kind of why we're saying that 3 to 5 years. We don't want it to get to that point on the lower right. Slats, they're the easiest thing out there. Everybody can see them. You're walking on them every day. They generally don't just fail all at once. They're failing very slowly over time. When you lose a beam, you're losing 6 slats all at once. A slat just doesn't typically go bad quickly like that. Once you start to see the crack on what we call the rail here, which is the length of the slat, it's in the rebar. People ask, is there something you can do to coat it? No, there isn't. Once it's in the rebar, the chemical process is going to take place. So the name of the game when you guys are trying to prevent this is keep patching your slats before it gets in the rebar. It's worth it. Once it's in the rebar, the clock's ticking and there's nothing we can do. There isn't a product out there that will stop that. But once you see it on the top, you'll start to see them blow out on the bottom, like in that top center picture. That's what the bottom side of that slat will look like. So again, the number of these we see in the count goes into the formula, and that's part of the predictive nature of it. This is a little less common type of cracking and what we call a shear crack. These are probably the ones to be really worried about. It's where they're cracking across the end of every rail. And that bottom right picture is kind of a result of what can happen when you see that. Again, it's not super common, but that's probably, if you're looking at slat cracks, that's the more dangerous one and the one to be the most concerned about. Number one service call we deal with is beam pockets. It was a poor design. It's on the end of the barns. On all these 40 wides, we shoved a beam into the end. Sometimes they just weren't deep enough. Sometimes the installer didn't get it put in there correctly. And a combination of either that just shearing out. Ultimately, I think what happens is these pits flex a little bit. We fill them up with 8 foot of manure. Those walls just slightly push out a little bit. We suck them down. And then that will get a water pressure rain event on the outside, and that wall moves in. It's just that millimeter every year of shifting back and forth where that beam walks out of that pocket is the best explanation I can get for it. Inside the barn, it just looks like a dip if it hasn't dropped in, but it's the number one service call. It always spikes in the fall for us. We get literally hundreds of these that we have to do repairs on. And then the last thing is just the bearing surface areas. I've touched on it before. You can see the column on the right. The one beam has got, 12 inches on there, and the other beam just has 2 inches. And again, it was fine for 20 years, but eventually the beam on the left is going to fail first. It's just got so much less surface bearing area to set on. And then what's it look like inside the barn if it hasn't dropped is it's just going to be a 2-inch lip. And so what I tell people all the time is if you're walking through a barn and you're tripping somewhere you've never tripped before, that's a problem. get out of there, get the pigs out of there, and give us a call. Yeah. So with that, talked about a lot of stuff, but I'll just end with this. You know, the new construction of 425 to 450 a pig space versus a total remodel. And I don't think you'd ever, in most cases, and you're never going to spend the full 250 on these barns, but that's what it looks like today. For an industry, if you back into the math of the 1,500 barns a year, if you use the top number, if we're going to build all new ones, tear the old ones down, it's $1 billion a year is what we need to be investing in this industry to keep up with those 1,500 barns. The remodel is $500 million a year is the math on that. And so unless the economics of this thing change, I think we're going to be doing a lot of that, which I know there's a lot of builders in the room. It's something to be excited about. The downside is remodels suck. They suck to bid. They suck to do because they're hard. It's more exciting to build new facilities. I'll be the first to admit that. But with that, this is my contact information. Feel free if you have a question or you want us to come do an inspection. We're happy to do that. And with that, I think we got a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, we can take one or two questions.
Okay. Gene's got one. Go ahead. I can.
As you've looked at slats, you showed cracks on the top, but didn't talk a lot about cracking on the bottom. That's what I would have anticipated seeing deterioration first. Is that right? And then secondly, do you like slat saver or not? Slat saver pads.
It's the wrong name. Let me answer that one first. The question was, do I like slat savers? No, it's not a slat saver. It's a problem relocator is what it is from our standpoint. It's a feed saver, right? So call it a feed saver mat. All it does is relocate the slat wear. Okay, if you want to do something for slats, protect them or patch them. The key is you got to get that feed, those salts and that moisture into the pit as quick as possible. All the slat savers do is move it over. So if I was going to use a slat saver, how I would use it is I'd put a really big one in, and every 5 years I'd cut 12 inches off of it. I'd just keep relocating it. No, seriously, that's how I would use it. Or start with a really small one and keep adding a bigger one. But it's not a slat saver, it's a feed saver. By the time you see the crack on the top, it's already blowing apart on the bottom, usually. And again, when we inspect a barn, if I'm in there for 40 minutes, 35 of it is looking at the columns and the beams, not the slats. The slats are easy. The real issue is happening underneath. So those beams are carrying 10,000 pounds apiece, so.
Brian. I know the answer is going to be depends on the condition of the slats, but typically where you're not seeing any rebar, what does it cost on a 2400 to go in and resurface the slats with the epoxy?
Anywhere from, it's a square footage, right? So anywhere from a really cheap slat, just slapping some patch on there would be $8-10 a square foot, to more of a premium epoxy or polymer applied would be about $12.50 a square foot. So if it's a 24 by 48 inch feeder, we don't have to do under the feeder. That's like brand new. We always do 3 rails in front and 12 inches on the ends. It's going to run about $350 a feeder to put down the more expensive polymer or epoxy. Does that answer your question? And if you got a wet dry feeder, yeah, so we'll basically ring that feeder, 3 rails in front of it, right in front of it, and 12 inches on the end. That's where the wear occurs. And if you got a wet dry feeder, you better be doing it, because I will tell you, they wear slats out at about twice the rate of a dry feeder. Mm-hmm.